We're continuing to focus on storytelling, Gareth, and in particular, the way that you get your story across. And right now, we're talking about the way that you speak in a way that your customer can understand, rather than speaking in a way that only you or your internal audience can understand. Talk to us a little bit about how you see people do this effectively, and maybe some of the pitfalls that you've also noticed.
Yes, and it's a very common thing where it's all too often when you're seeing presentations or stories, as we like to call them, that are given to customers. Often it very much has the appearance of being an internally focused story and not much about the customer at all. So there's something there about the construct of that. Well, we've touched on that before. I guess there's also something there about how we deliver the story and therefore use as much of the customer's language when we're telling the story to make it their story as opposed to just our story. So it's about using as much of their language as possible to link your story to what's important to them.
So that sounds very simple, Gareth, and it sounds very obvious as well, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. What is it that stops people from doing it? And if you were to give one tip on how to enable people to do it more effectively and more easily, what would you do? What would you say?
Yeah, it's simple and it's obvious, but often, it's a bit like common sense. Common sense often isn't very common. And, we've touched on this before. One of the big things that people often miss is using questions, understanding the customer's world. If you've got that intelligence and you've spent the time actually invested in that intelligence, when you're delivering your story, it's therefore about using that intelligence to make it their story. So relate it back to some of the things that your customer said. So it's about using language like, your business, you mentioned one of the priorities you were looking for, an issue that you mentioned. It's this type of phraseology that therefore is much more likely to feel like it's their story as to just one that you've effectively taken from one customer to another. You've copied and pasted, maybe you've changed the logo, hopefully that type of thing. But it's about making it their story. So as much of the language that they have used, bringing your story to life and using that.
And so, Gareth, if I was to summarize what I'm hearing, there's almost two things in here that are slightly different. One is the obvious stuff about using their language. So when you're preparing your story, thinking about their world, their language, their measurements, etc., and their KPIs, anything that they're using as their terminology. But there's also something else which is much more subtle, which is the in the moment stuff. So what is it that they are saying right now? What is it that they said very recently, within minutes of that particular part of your story, for example? So it's making it really come alive in the moment, as well as generally using their language. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, absolutely. That's spot on. And I think the key word you used there was subtle. It's subtle, but it makes a tremendously large difference to make it their story.
Okay, thanks, Gareth.